Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Misha Rangel. I'm the Director of Enterprise Product Marketing, and I have with me today my colleague Dave Russell, who's the Vice President of Enterprise Strategy and all-around guru of all things enterprise backup. And we're excited to present to you today the state of the backup market in 2022. So we will go ahead and get started. Dave, thanks for being here with us today.
Yeah, awesome to be here. Thank you everyone for joining. And so what we thought we would do is we just divided this into about 4 sections, and to level set, what we wanted to do is just take through a couple steps looking at what are some of the industry analysts saying about the market, including some really just published data that just has come out only in the last week. So if we go to the first slide in this section, if we look at what IDC has to say or track in this market, IDC every 6 months, so that's why it's a biannual tracker, comes out with their view of the top data protection vendors in the market. Their market, as they define it, is called data replication and protection. You can just substitute backup for the word protection. So it's all things replication, and backup is what's being tracked. They're looking at this every 6 months. And when they say replication, Misha, they mean array-based replication, server-based replication, really any kind of replication technology. The way IDC conducts this is they list by name the top 5 vendors. The rest of the vendors that they track, they put into the other categories, meaning vendors number 6 through the rest of the list. And then they detail out the market average as well. And they publish this, like I say, every 6 months. The most recent publication, which is only about 6 weeks old, looks at the second half of 2021, and here we're viewing the worldwide numbers. Now, what you see here is an interesting result. The first time I've personally ever seen this in our market space. They, IDC, are deeming Dell Technologies and Veeam in a statistical tie for the #1 vendor globally. Now, if you look at the third column from the left, you'll see from a revenue perspective, Dell Technologies is actually slightly higher than Veeam, meaning Dell's representing $66.5 million, Veeam $64.7 million. But the little fine print in the lower right-hand side there in green is that IDC's methodology is if 2 vendors are right next to each other and separated by less than half a percentage point of market share, they are deemed to be in a statistical tie. And Misha, what we see here on the right-hand column is indeed not just half a percent, but 0.3% or less than 1/3 of a percent separates the top 2 vendors. So Veeam and Dell deemed a statistical tie. You can see the number 3 vendor, the number 4 vendor, number 5 vendor listed. The one thing I would point out, though, is that if you see the 2 tied vendors, one is growing double digits year over year. The other is declining double digits year over year. And I would also mention that Veeam actually is growing 4 times faster than the market average and is 7 times higher from a growth rate perspective than the other highest growth vendor in the top 5 that's named that's not Veeam. And this has been true for the last 8 reporting periods where Veeam has been the fastest growing year over year on the top 5 vendors or the other providers of the overall market. Now, if we go to the next slide, this is a global webinar, and obviously these results are worldwide as well. What I like to point out is, again, using IDC's numbers, the Veeam is growing double digits in all 4 geographic theaters. And in fact, in the Southern Hemisphere of Latin America and Asia Pacific, Japan, Veeam is actually growing the fastest. So we've got a lot of penetration Veeam does in Europe in particular and in North America, double-digit growth in those theaters as well. But if you are a global corporation or if you are in one of these 4 regions, you can feel confident that Veeam is demonstrating great growth, has a lot of viability and customer penetration in your specific market. Now, the next slide just published last week. It is the new 2022 Gartner Magic Quadrant, the full title is Gartner Magic Quadrant for Enterprise Data Center Backup and Recovery Software Solutions. We've got a little URL there in orange, and if you hang on tight till the end, we'll give you an easy QR code where you can go download this report. But if you just want to write down VEE.am/MQ22, that just means Magic Quadrant 2022, you can actually go check out this report for yourselves. It's the full report. So it's not just about Veeam, it's everything Gartner published. Obviously this graphic that you see here, but there's dozens of other pages, in fact, close to about 40 other pages that accompany a Magic Quadrant, including write-ups on every one of the vendors that are listed in this Magic Quadrant. Now, Veeam, we're really proud to have been now for the 6th consecutive year in the Leaders Quadrant, and for the 3rd consecutive year, rated highest in ability to execute, that y-axis. You can see Veeam is higher than any other vendor. Now, one of the things that we know is that Veeam's major next release is not happening or taking place in this review cycle for the Magic Quadrant, unlike prior years. So that's one of the reasons why we think we're not as far over to the right in terms of vision, because the vision axis, or the x-axis, is largely historically reflective on what you've done in the last 12 to 18 months. Now, want to point out one of the things, Misha, I always like to joke about, and this is a good bit of trivia. Very, very few people know why it's called a Magic Quadrant. Gideon Gartner, who helped devise this methodology, and obviously he founded Gartner, his view was that if a vendor could get into the Leaders Quadrant, and obviously not all ever will, that the magic would be if you could actually get into the Leaders Quadrant without having to traverse the other 3, the Niche Quadrant, the Visionary Quadrant, the Challengers Quadrant, and the Leaders Quadrant. The reason for that was he did a bunch of statistical analysis quite a number of years ago, over 20 years ago, and concluded that the natural progression for a vendor was a backwards Z, meaning they would land in the lower left in the niche player, work on their product, and move over to the lower right in the Visionary Quadrant, then begin to work on business activities such as customer support and alliances and partnerships and marketing, and then probably move up to the Challengers Quadrant in the upper left. And if they could actually do both product and non-product things successfully, they might eventually move into the Leaders Quadrant in the upper right. So the magic would be if you could get to Leaders without passing through Niche, Visionary, and Challenger. Veeam is the first vendor in all of storage, not just the backup Magic Quadrant, the primary array, the network attached storage, the virtual tape library, the archiving, the deduplication Magic Quadrants, all of them in the history of the company. Veeam was the first to achieve the magic, first appearing in the lower right in Visionary, so skipping Niche, and then going straight up into the Leaders Quadrant. So with that as a backdrop, Misha, why don't you take us through something that's really first and foremost on all of our minds?
Thanks, Dave. I gotta say, I think you should get an award for packing the most insights and market intelligence in a presentation in less than 10 minutes. I definitely learned something. That was super interesting and insightful. Hopefully everyone found it valuable. And now I'm going to talk about, something that is probably on the top of everyone's mind in terms of 2022 and planning for 2023, and that is ransomware. And we have some pretty interesting stats and insights for you regarding ransomware. So this table is actually sourced from our data protection trends report. This is an annual piece of research that we develop here at Veeam, where we survey the entire market. It's unbiased, not just Veeam customers. So we have a really good finger on the pulse of what's going on with some of these top trends. So this slide is a little bit scary, I'll be honest with you. So when we asked IT organizations how many ransomware attacks that they've suffered in the last 12 months, 76% of organizations have experienced at least one ransomware attack. And if you see from this chart, the highest frequency is 2 or 3 ransomware attacks. So the old adage of, it's not if, it's when, is definitely coming to fruition for ransomware, unfortunately. So not to be a downer, but just to kind of add onto the concern with ransomware. The same research study, our data protection trends report, showed that on average, only 64% of an organization's data was recoverable after a ransomware attack. So you could see there is a lot of gaps when it comes to recovery from this type of event. So ransomware is obviously called ransomware because the cyber attackers are demanding a ransom. And one other interesting piece of insights is, whether companies decided to pay the ransom. Now, this data point is actually from another research report that we produce here at Veeam. It's called the Ransomware Trends Report. This was published back in May. So this is pretty interesting. So if you start it at kind of the 10 o'clock mark on the time clock of 19% of companies saying that they were able to recover data without paying. So 19% of companies are kind of coming out of this in the best case scenario, in our opinion, right? This is ideal. You don't have to pay the ransom and you are still able to recover the data. Unfortunately, the red bar of our pie chart is kind of the worst case scenario. So 24%, almost a quarter of companies paid the ransom and they still couldn't recover their data. You may ask why this is, and the answer may be a little obvious. I mean, when you're dealing with cyber attackers, you're not necessarily dealing with super dependable individuals. So the circumstance of paying the ransom and then still not getting the encryption key is a big possibility. And then you see from here, a majority of companies did pay the ransom and they were able to recover the data. So a positive solution, although an expensive solution. So our mission here at Veeam is to grow that dark green chart bar of 19% able to recover data without paying to 100% of people surveying, and basically putting those cyber attackers out of business. All right, Dave. So, if we're talking about ransomware, let's talk about orchestration and kind of how to automate some of these DR capabilities.
Yeah, and the reason we thought this fit really appropriately right here after ransomware was that if ransomware hits, and Misha showed you the statistics, it's very likely to hit you regardless of your company size, your geographic location, the industry that you're in. It's just a crime of opportunity most often. So the recovery or the remediation from that really depends on proper orchestration and automation. If we go to the next slide, one of the things we'd like to point out is why in 2022, Misha, are we still talking about backup and recovery? Aren't all systems reliable? Don't we have redundant components like multiple power supplies, hot swappable componentry, etc.? And this chart, also from our Data Protection Trends report, shout out to our colleagues, Jason Buffington and Julie Webb, who helped drive this. This is the industry's largest ever report in the history of our space, 3,400 responses. What we see if we do one more click, let's just notice all of the different things here in the middle that actually can take down a server unexpectedly. Now, let me help you decompose what this chart's trying to tell us. The longer green bars are all the causes that took down a server without planning for that in the last year or 12 months. And then we looked at vote once for the most impactful cause of an outage in the prior year, in 2021 and in 2020, because we've been doing this survey now for going on 4 years. What you can immediately see, Misha, even if you don't look at all of the fine print, meaning what are all the causes, right away what jumps out is there are many, many different things within the data center that are going, unfortunately, awry that can cause an outage. So we see networking, applications, server, operating systems, cloud outages, storage issues. So it's not like we can just go solve for one thing, say networking. Now, because we want to tie this back in a little bit, if we click one more time, unfortunately, what we see is human causality is at the top. Now, what we see are two kinds of humans. The malicious actor that Misha alluded to from a cyber perspective or ransomware issue, that has topped the list in terms of the most impactful, but also very, very high on all the causes for an outage. Second is the accidental deletion or accidental overwrite or corruption of data. So the net takeaway from here is the reason backup becomes hugely important, even still in 2022, and as we look ahead, is that many things continue to go wrong. And Misha, one of the things I always like to point out here is when we looked at the other kinds of things that can go wrong, meaning the non-human side, typically in an average year, we only restored 3 to 5% of the data that we backed up, but we didn't know which 3 to 5% of the data it would be. And of course, we didn't know exactly when, what day, or what week that might be required. Unfortunately, ransomware has an attack surface of 100% of your data and could hit it multiple different times. In fact, if you recall Misha's statistics, the highest responses were that an organization got hit twice or 3 times in a year by ransomware. So that means twice or 3 times up to 100% of your data could be taken out. That's why orchestration and automation really matters. So if we go to the next slide, let's double click on that. You'll see the acronym BCDR. Many of you are probably familiar with that. That just means business continuity and disaster recovery. So we asked a specific question here in orange about failover and failback mechanisms. The question was, what kind of failover failback mechanisms does your organization use to resume functionality or to recover from a business continuity disaster recovery event? Much like the data that Misha showed around ransomware, the results are a little concerning because what we would say is the optimal answer is the lowest. So right away, similar to what Misha's chart showed, around the 10 o'clock mark, going around the dial, the best answer is that 25% that said we have orchestrated workflows that will reconnect resources and that are now running remotely. So 1 out of 4 had a fully automatic response plan. If we go around though the clock, 29% said we're going to manually reconfigure and reconnect during a crisis. And Misha, of course, as we all know, things go wrong in the heat of the moment. This is the worst time to exercise your plan to understand if you truly have the appropriate capabilities, the runbook knowledge, the ISO images, everything at your disposal. Somewhere in between, but still not quite ideal, is a little less than half said we have predefined scripts for reconnecting resources. But the challenge is configuration drift. You know, scripts can be out of date. Scripts could be issued or performed in the past by professional services written by those services teams as well that are no longer part of the payroll or no longer at your disposal. So the rescue that begs the question, what's the right answer? Well, in our opinion, what we'd like to impart to you is the best thing from a ransomware and BCDR perspective, if we go to the next slide, is really first and foremost understanding that disasters come in all shapes and sizes, including ransomware. We like to say that ransomware is a disaster. In fact, our colleague Jason likes to say that migration is a disaster that you plan for because it's just as impactful if you haven't accounted for everything. So the ability to capture data from multiple sources, continuous data protection, replication through replicas, your traditional nightly backup, or your storage array snapshot integration is really the position you want to be in. Get the data from a variety of sources, be able to dynamically or automatically update that documentation, and to be able to schedule tests so that you know ahead of time that you're indeed truly recoverable. And then when it comes time to recover, to be able to instrument or hit that button for one-click recovery. So we mentioned cloud a little bit, Misha, but maybe we want to go deeper on that.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. We like to say here at Veeam that backup is your last line of defense. And I really love that because, planning is your best friend when it comes to any disaster. And obviously with these trends, it's becoming more essential than ever. And we have some of the tools to help you get there. Okay, now to switch gears a little bit and talk about cloud. Of course, another big topic on how things are changing within an IT organization's environment. So a couple of data points here from yet another research report that we produce here at Veeam. This one is called the Cloud Data Protection Trends Report. We are currently working on our refresh, our 2022 version of this report that will be out and available in a couple months. So this data is looking at for production workloads that are living within the cloud, where did they originate? And this data is pretty interesting because it shows almost a perfect, three-way split between where those workloads were originally created. So on the top left, you have 38% that were essentially cloud native and first created in a cloud and have lived in the cloud their entire existence. And then you have 30% that have been migrated from physical servers, and then 32% migrated from virtual machines. So, I think the takeaway from this is that, the data center is, a living, moving thing. Nothing is staying in one place, and that we need good connectivity and ability to move and transfer data from one state to another depending on the business needs. So interestingly, not only is data moving to the cloud, but it is also being brought back from the cloud as well. And, this can be for a number of different reasons. One of probably the main ones is that, cloud and kind of more of a consumption model pricing can be pretty expensive. So especially when you're moving some of these mission critical, super huge workloads to the cloud, you may get there and decide, wow, this is really expensive in terms of, egress costs, et cetera. May want to move those back to the data center. So the data here below shows that 23% of the data was developed in the cloud, workloads were developed in the cloud, and they're bringing them back to a data center. 23% migrated from on-prem to a cloud, but decided to bring back on-prem, so call that like boomerang, right? And then 7% in a disaster, and then the other, the remainder is, that they haven't brought cloud-hosted workloads back to the data center. So a good variety with a really strong showing of this data repatriation back to the data center. So this is just kind of going through some of customers' main objectives and what they're looking for in the context of data protection within the cloud. And really, it is no different than what companies are looking to do with any other type of workload, right? So there needs to be backup and archival, direct disaster recovery, ransom protection, as well as the ability to migrate and modernize that we talked about earlier. So everything that is needed for traditional workloads within the data center is also needed within the cloud. And that can be offered in a number of different capabilities and ways. So for your cloud native workloads, backups that work natively with the major cloud platforms like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, your SaaS applications, so Microsoft 365 and Salesforce, that is making up such a huge amount of an organization's data consumption. Cloud mobility, again, what we talked about earlier, and being able to have the flexibility to move workloads from one environment to another. And a little teaser to our next section, Kubernetes, containerized workloads, which is an up and coming trend that we're seeing among how to modernize legacy applications. So Dave, let's talk a little bit more about containers.
Yeah, we really wanted to mention containers here to round out our discussion, because depending on who you speak with, you get a different view of just how penetrated or mainstream container technology is. The short takeaway is, from the research that we've done, if you ask the traditional infrastructure operations teams or the backup teams, roughly speaking, containers is something that's going to take shape in production about 2 years from now. When we speak to the application development DevOps teams, containers have been in production en masse for about 2 years. So we've got a gap of about 4 years there. One group thinks that they're already utilizing this. Another group thinks that they'll need to plan for that, but maybe in the future. We're suggesting that probably for the traditional infrastructure teams and for the backup recovery, disaster recovery teams, container technology is happening faster than you may be aware of. It's analogous, Misha, to going back to, pick your time frame, but around 2007, 2008, when VMware vSphere really became in production mode versus the back office kind of a deployment that we saw. Something similar in containers is happening, but happening at an even faster rate. So to help bear that out, prove this point, let's go to the next slide and just look at some more data that we've got that double clicks on this. Now, I will admit, this comes from our data protection trends report, and to get into our containers line of questioning, there was a little bit of a kick out or an exclusive comment what you had to check, which is, do you have direct knowledge of the container activity in your organization? So that's why the sample size goes down to about 1,400. And it's admittedly a bit of a biased group because they are running containers, and whoever responded of that 1,364 claims to understand what's going on with regards to containers in their area. But the takeaway, Misha, is that even if this is somewhat self-selecting, what we get from this is 0 said that they have no plans to run containers in production. So all 1,364 respondents from around the globe, 28 different countries we surveyed, they all plan to go into production with containers. Now let's double click on that. Over half, 56%, are saying they are already running containers in production. And I can remember when I was a Gartner analyst, Misha, this probably goes back about 7 or 8 years ago. And one of my colleagues at a conference said on stage, if you have developers, you already have containers. You just may or may not know about it. And that's really the myth bust that we want to kind of convey here, that containers are probably further along in your organization than you may actually be aware of. So we want to kind of open up that awareness level and offer some considerations for you as well. Now, a little over a third said that they're running containers in production, but they are planning for deployments later. Or I'm sorry, not yet running in production. So they're kind of piloting. They're looking to go live. They may not be live yet, but obviously heading down that path. And then less than 1 out of 10 at 9% said we are not running containers in production or in deployments, but are interested in doing that. So that hopefully sets the stage for this is happening. It is already taking place, meaning container adoption and containers in production. Now, if we look at the next slide, who's involved with this? Very, very interesting. We get this very split. If we take out that 5% saying, I'm not sure who's protecting my Kubernetes data, what we get are 4 different personas. What you see on the top portion, the top half, is 2 different kinds of people from the infrastructure team. The team that manages their traditional backup over on the upper left, the team that manages their storage on the upper right, and then on the bottom half, you see on the lower left, the team that manages the Kubernetes framework itself, and then on the lower right, the application teams or maybe the DevOps teams might be involved in backup. So very, very interesting, 4 different personas, not quite evenly split, but 4 somewhat close to equal different groups that today are involved with protecting containers. Part of the reason for that is there have not been a great deal of tooling capabilities delivered to the market for container backup capabilities. And naturally at Veeam, we think we've got one that's worth your checking out, and we'll decompose that in a moment. But I think, Misha, what we see here is reflective of a point in time for the deployment of containers in production, meaning various teams have stepped up to try to ensure that they can offer backup recovery, disaster recovery, also leverage those availability tools for migration, maybe migration from development to production or on-prem to cloud, or to your point, cloud back on-prem even. So something to keep an eye on, but we believe that over time, we will see more and more of the traditional backup teams, that 20% in the upper left, begin to have a more active role in container backup. Now, one thing that's probably going to be different than the VMware vSphere or hypervisor production usage overall is that if we follow that lineage going back 2007, 2008 to today, there was no virtual administrator. The server administrator often started off being the one responsible for deploying a hypervisor, then took it upon themselves to look for a tool to back up those VMs, and then eventually went to the traditional backup team and said, hey, this is now some large number. It's 100, it's 200, it's 300 VMs, and many of these have production qualities associated with them, so you take it over. So it was really a transfer of responsibility if we go back to the virtualization era. What we really think, though, what will persist is that there will be 2 distinct personas that remain involved with availability for Kubernetes. The application development team, who are looking at this as a migration tool, and then the traditional backup teams who are looking at this from a backup and disaster recovery perspective. So now let's double click on what are some of the considerations that you might want to look for in a Kubernetes solution. So I'll decompose what these 5 things are. I'll just go around starting in the upper left and then go clockwise. Application centric. We think of the application as the operational unit in a Kubernetes environment. So we need to complete an appropriate and complete application capture of the configuration and all the data elements associated with that. And in Kubernetes, that is abstracted from the underlying infrastructure, similar to virtualization. And the coordination across that, or maintaining application integrity, but also the configuration integrity is important. So then we get to observability. So observability means that you have visibility into the status of all of your operations. It's easy to determine if something is completed or not and what corrective requirements might be needed. And you get out of the box dashboards and metrics and alerts. So the kinds of things that we're traditionally used to in our hardened backup software that we're in production with today. Now, next off, if we look a little bit at the confidence in meeting your service level agreements, your recovery objectives. It needs to be simple, it needs to be speedy or fast to get you back up and running quickly. And you need to have the flexibility to ensure you can recover from a variety of different events. It could be just a configuration outage, it could be ransomware, it could be a migration. Similar constructs that Veeam was built on as well. And that's why we actually chose to make an investment in this space. We saw a lot of parallels with Veeam's heritage and where Kubernetes is getting deployed. So next, we see policy-driven data management, or the ability to set up custom policies to meet your needs so that you can set it and forget it, not have to look at things from an ad hoc perspective, because your pod or collection of Kubernetes containers may be associated with a business activity. And you may want to manage that accordingly versus manage all of the different container constructs independently. And then freedom of choice. Seamlessly support different kinds of storage, different kinds of data services across clusters, regions, or even clouds to abstract you from that complexity. Amisha, a lot of those things probably sound very familiar. Those are Veeam design tenets going back quite a number of years in the virtualized space, but now extending into the cloud native world, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, and of course, on-prem.
All right, well, I hope that everyone has learned a few things, especially going into, we're in Q3. I'm sure a lot of us are, taking a look at next year and what some of our key priorities are going to be. We've gone over some market insights, some key trends that are top of mind of IT organizations around the world. And I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about, some of our accolades within the enterprise space with our focus. And, obviously Dave and I are kind of laser focused on enterprise and the capabilities that Veeam has to serve this group of customers. So just some other stats that you may not know. First of all, 53% of our revenue last year came from the enterprise segment. So, Veeam is established and has proven success within the space. We have 81% of the Fortune 500 companies using Veeam and 69% of the Global 2000. And I love these stats down here listed on the bottom in terms of, featuring some of our largest implementations. When you think Veeam, you can definitely think scale as well. We have 65,000 Microsoft 365 seats implemented at a customer, 20,000 VMs protected by one VBR server, and 11 million seats of Microsoft 365 with one client. So, definitely Veeam scales to the enterprise. So last but not least, I just wanted to give another quick mention of the Gartner Magic Quadrant. As Dave said, this is hot off the press. It was just announced last week. So we're kind of getting you the freshest information here. Highly encourage, scan the QR, visit our URL, and download the full Gartner Magic Quadrant report. If you have questions, please reach out. We're happy to help, and hopefully you've gotten some good insights from this presentation. Dave, any last words?
Yeah, we did have one question that came in, and it had to do with market share, and said, well, what about Europe or Africa? What is the penetration in those markets? And I assume that means what's the Veeam penetration? Yeah, Veeam has been #1 in the EMEA, or Europe, Middle East, Africa region now for 9 reporting periods, or 4.5 years. So in addition to being #1 globally, #1 in Europe and Africa as well. Another question, Misha, had to do with, do I have to consume all of the Veeam components? Is it an overall product, or are there pieces? I thought I'd let you take that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have our Veeam platform. Our flagship product is Veeam Backup and Recovery. And then we have additional workloads that we cover, such as Microsoft 365 and soon to be Salesforce, as well as our Kubernetes offering that can be added onto those, in addition to our core backup and recovery product offering You can also upgrade to include monitoring and analytics, which we highly recommend. Some really cool capabilities within our Veeam One offering, as well as an additional add-on to get kind of everything you need with respect to ransomware recovery as well. So our platform is our flagship product, Veeam Backup and Recovery, also known as VBR. And then we have several upgrades and add-ons that can be tailored to your organization's needs. So hopefully that helps.
Brilliant, yes. One question came in, does Veeam offer immutability? And short answer is yes, absolutely. And much like all the design tenets that we've got, we really try to offer flexibility or choice in that. Our colleague Rick Vanover likes to talk about double play or even triple play immutability. In fact, when we've done some research, what we've seen is most organizations strive for immutability in multiple locations or multiple points in their overall backup or availability process. So let's give you some examples. Veeam actually natively supports tape. Tape sometimes is a favorable and sometimes an unfavorable four-letter word. I happen to be a fan of tape, particularly in this context, and particularly if you've already made the investment in that kind of infrastructure. It is truly the most air-gapped, offline, immutable solution that you can get today. It doesn't require services, etc. So physical tape is certainly one. Misha, the one that I use in my home lab, Veeam has the ability after a backup to eject a logical drive, meaning a physical USB drive. So I use USB-C. It's a faster transport than the old USB. And I back up to external SSD drives or all flash drives. After that backup is done, around midnight my time, it logically ejects from Windows. So it's physically attached, but the Windows volume manager and file system cannot see that drive. So it is, all intents and purposes, unattainable or unable to get attacked from anything that might reside on my system. But other examples include our great partner ecosystem, include everything from great work that our organizations and partners out in the field like Exagrid, Cloudian, with so many others, HPE, StoreOnce, Quantum, lots of different solutions, be they disk-based appliances or object storage. Or speaking of object storage, you can go to cloud. We offer immutability in Amazon AWS. We've announced intention to support in our next release immutability in Azure Cloud, and many other ways as well. So in addition to just picking one of these, we suggest you consider multiple, but pick the one that's appropriate for you and your business. And then lastly, there was a notion about, does that Veeam Kubernetes product integrate with the rest of the environment? Short answer is yes. You can, from the Veeam Backup and Replication console, you can monitor and understand what's going on in the Kasten, or we call the product K10. You can understand what's going on in that environment. And then one that just literally came in, so before we sign off, I want to get to this one. Is Veeam going to offer a community or home lab license? Being a person that has been through a ransomware event, being able to test in a non-prod, non-production environment would be great. Wow, that's an awesome setup, because the short answer is yes. And for many, many years, Veeam has been offering no charge, meaning free versions of our solutions. We call them community editions. In fact, we have over 1 million downloads of our community edition for Veeam Backup and Replication. And it allows you to protect up to 10 different machines at no charge forever, for perpetually free. So definitely encourage you to check that out. You can go right to the Veeam website, look at products, and we have a tab under there called free products. And you can download that right from there, including supporting documentation. In this day and age though, yeah, definitely encourage everyone in your home lab, or even to protect your home environment, be sure to check out the tools we've got at your disposal. So with that, I think that we're all done with questions. I'm just going to double check one more, and I think we've got it. Misha, I think we're done for today.
Awesome, great discussion. Thank you so much. Really good questions. And Dave, it kind of makes me smile, tape and disc. It's like what's old is new again. So But yeah, definitely Veeam is designed for immutability everywhere. So love that discussion and as well. So thanks so much, and we appreciate you all. Have a good day. Bye.